The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 17th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
What do baseball teams and pancakes have in common? They both need a good batter. Sorry, that was the best pancake joke I could find. All the rest of them fell flat. Oh. Well, as you know, Luther League is hosting a pancake dinner today after church in honor of Pancake Day. This coming Tuesday. I always assumed IHOP made up this Pancake Day as their own holiday, but it really goes back centuries, and really it's a part of this whole celebration of Mardi Gras and Shrove Tuesday as well. Maybe you all know the history of these celebrations, but if you don't, or if you've forgotten, you at least know that we are about to enter the season of Lent. Lent is known as a season of fasting, as a way to remember Jesus' time in the wilderness and all that he gave up for us. For some, that Lenten fasting might mean refraining from eating indulgent foods. And so then in order to more easily fast from those foods, or so they don't go bad before the Easter celebration, you wanted to use up those ingredients. So leading up to, and then especially the day before Lent began, what we call Shrove Tuesday, or Pancake Day, many people would clean out their cupboards of those ingredients. Eggs and butter and sugar, flour. But if you know as well as I do, when you put those ingredients together, you get pancakes. Hence, Pancake Day was born. And now are you hungry? But then also, as I said earlier, Pancake Day is closely connected to this tradition of Shrove Tuesday. That word shrove is the past tense of the word shrive, obviously, which is this traditional religious term that refers to the act of confession and forgiveness. So that day before Ash Wednesday, before Lent began, this day of Shrove Tuesday was the time for people to come and visit their priest or their pastor, to have private confession, and then to be absolved or receive forgiveness, be shriven, so that you would be ready to enter the season of Lent. So I'll have a sign-up sheet on my office door for anyone who'd like to come do that. Well, over time, as we know, things change. So instead of confessing and speaking all of that sin out of ourselves to begin and be ready for that season of Lent, we know that people started, let's say, performing all of the sin and temptation out of their system. We started stuffing ourselves with those indulgent foods that we were going to try to avoid in the weeks to come. We'd have that last chocolate bar before avoiding it for at least a week. We'd fill up on pancakes and donuts and anything else that contained flour and sugar. We would party like there's no tomorrow because tomorrow we're not supposed to party. All these practices of getting it out of our system brought about those traditions like Carnival and Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is then French for Fat Tuesday, that day, that season of stuffing yourself of those things that were being avoided or given up for Lent. Who would have thought that beads and masks and pancakes were meant to prepare us for the most solemn season in the life of the church? So for me, at least, that's why it seems so fitting that the last weekend in the church year, every year before Lent begins, we hear the story of Jesus' Transfiguration. It's a story that shows up in 3 of the 4 Gospels. We just heard it, where Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up on a mountaintop and is transfigured before them. He begins to glow. His face shines like the sun. His clothes become dazzling white. The disciples are amazed. They're overwhelmed. They're frightened. I mean, who would not be overwhelmed by that kind of a sight? Usually, if we see someone's face changing colors, they're either going to be sick or pass out. But then on top of that sight of Jesus' transformation, the disciples look up to see Jesus talking, not to himself, but to Moses and Elijah. Out of nowhere, these 2 prophets who were long gone at this point, who simply appeared in the midst of this light show. And then, if that wasn't enough, as these disciples were trying to make heads or tails out of what was happening before their eyes, suddenly then that bright cloud overshadows them, and that voice speaks from the cloud to say that this is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Okay? So Jesus is glowing. Dead people are just casually hanging out with glowing Jesus. And God's voice is booming from the sky with these very parental words of, listen to this glowing, talking to dead people Jesus. I imagine the disciples are beginning to wonder if something was wrong with their pancakes that they had the night before. What was going on? Again, this is where I see it to be fitting that this weekend sets us up to be ready for Lent, just like Mardi Gras and Shrove Tuesday and Pancake Day do. Just like we like to lay it all out there before having to behave ourselves for a whole 40 days, except for Sundays in Lent, we don't count those. But just in that same way, God and Jesus are laying it all out there for these disciples to see, for them to truly see who Jesus is, before having to come back down the mountain and back to their regularly scheduled journey. We know that unless you eat something really, really strange, no human being is going to begin to glow like Jesus did. So these disciples are witnesses to Jesus' identity as being holy and equivalent to God, unlike any other human being. And then when they see Moses and Elijah as faithful followers who are well versed in the Jewish tradition, these disciples see their rabbi and teacher talking to these 2 important figures who represent the law and the prophets in their tradition, whose role is to point to who God is. Then once they are gone, however, only Jesus remains to represent their Messiah, even as he talks about his death and resurrection that is to come. And then again, to top it all off with God's own voice, declaring Jesus to be God's beloved Son, the one who pleases God and the one to whom they should listen. Now at that point, if they don't think Jesus is who he said he was after all, there's probably nothing that will convince those disciples to believe otherwise. So here's this experience on top of this mountain where God dumps all of these identities and all of this evidence on top of these disciples about who Jesus is. And then as they are descending back down the mountain, what does Jesus tell them? He says, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anyone this vision or this experience that they just had until after Jesus, the Son of Man, has been raised from the dead. That's quite a secret to keep. Well, as we know, there are stories in the Gospels that point to the fact that these disciples still don't fully understand or believe who Jesus is and what he's come to do until he rises from the dead and appears to them all once again. Which is probably the reason why Jesus tells them not to tell anyone about this vision until they can really see and understand the full story of what's going on. So the question then that we're left with is, where does that leave us? Over these past 2 months, we've experienced all kinds of things, right? A miraculous birth. We've heard angels of God telling everyone the news. We've seen wise men traveling long distances to witness and testify to who Jesus is. We've seen prophecies come to fruition. We've witnessed Jesus' own baptism, this dove descending from heaven, in addition to the claim on all of us, each one of us, to be one of God's very own children ourselves. We've listened on the side of a mountain, no less, as Jesus talked about how the entire order of the world would be turned on its head. And now we've seen for ourselves this transfiguration event. What are we supposed to do? Well, with all of this evidence and experience given to us, I feel as if the only thing we can do is to share it with all the world, to put it all out there as if there is no tomorrow. As always, though, that kind of a call and task to witness can feel utterly daunting. I mean, what if we forget part of the story? What if we get distracted and mess up? What if our inevitable sin gets in the way of this proclamation? Well, I think it's important for us to remember that we are not the ones who were glowing, or we are not the ones being transfigured as Christ was. So instead, what if we could see ourselves as being, let's say, mirrors as we tell this story? We aren't the source of this light, but rather we serve as reflections of the light, shining this light of Christ back into the world. The words Jesus shares with his disciples at the top of the mountain can be the same words given for us, where he says, "Get up and do not be afraid." What we have seen has changed us. But we also know the rest of the story that those disciples did not, as they came down from the top of the mountain. And now that we are at this crossroads, as we are ready to enter this season of Lent, where we are about to remember who Jesus is as he suffered and died for us, we can be sustained for that journey thanks to who Jesus has been revealed to be as God's own Son, the beloved, the one who he himself laid it all out there and gave everything for us. The least that we can do, I think, is to reflect that light. Amen.